And I'm wondering if... Oh no. Over the last few weeks, I've been asked the same question quite a few times from different people, so I thought it'd be good to address it today in a video. So the question is, can you put down a base with pastel pencils and then add the details over the top with Polychromos? So let's do a few tests to see if it's possible, and then we can try and draw a picture. I got a few different papers to run some tests. On the left I have Bristol board, and then I have Canson drawing paper, then Clairefontaine pastel mat, and finally on the right hand side I have Daler-Rowney Ingra paper. So it's kind of split into two sections. I've got drawing paper on the left and pastel paper on the right. So initially I wanted to test how well the pastel goes down on the paper. So I wanted to make a gradient going from yellow into orange. I wanted to test how well the pastel goes down on the paper, how vibrant it looks, as well as how well it blends. So once I built up some of the pastel, I'm then going to use this blending tool just to push that pastel into each of the papers. And because I wanted to build up a decent amount of the pastel on each of these papers, I did do a second layer as well. So now I have my pastel base down. The first thing I wanted to test is how the pastel performs just on its own. So I wanted to put the white pencil over the top of these layers just to see how vibrant that white is. From here I wanted to put some Polychromos over the top just to get a bit of an idea on how well that shows up. So I used quite a bright red and just made some flicks going horizontally over each of the patches. I did the same with a much darker colour because again I wanted to see how that shows up. And then I used a orange pencil just to create a little bit of shading down the bottom. I just wanted to see if it was possible to shade over the top of what I have here. So if I'm able to adjust the colours with the Polychromos on top of the pastel. And then the last thing I'm doing here is I took the same pencil that I used before. I sharpened it with a really fine point. I'm trying to see how clear and sharp a line I can do on each paper and if having the pastel affects that. So let's start taking away the papers that I'm not happy with. First up, I don't like the Canson drawing paper. The white pastel pencil doesn't really show up at all over the swatch that I made. And I generally think the pastel looks quite muted, it's not very vibrant. I'm also going to take away the pastel mat. Although the white does look much better here, I just really struggle to make a very fine line with the Polychromos. And since I'm wanting to use the Polychromos for adding details over the top of the pastel, that is something I really need. This then comes down to whether I want to use Bristol board or I want to use the Ingra paper. I'd say that most of the tests, they performed quite similarly really. The only thing that is strikingly different is how white the white pastel at the very top of the swatch looks. It is far more vibrant on the Ingra paper. It does seem like I'm still able to make very thin lines with the Polychromos over the top. So I would say that the Ingra paper is the one that ticks all the boxes. That's the one I'll be using. Now I know which paper to use, I need to decide on what to draw. I'm feeling quite autumny at the moment, so let's draw a pumpkin. If you'd like to draw this pumpkin with me, I do have a full real-time tutorial on my Patreon, along with loads of other tutorials. Every tutorial includes the reference photo, swatches of all of the colours I'll be using, and a sketch outline. Check out the link in the description. Now I want to start this drawing off in the way that I do with all of my pastel drawings. I'm beginning with the background and I'm looking for the most obvious mid-tone colours. So I put those down initially and then start building up other colours on top of that. I generally start with the most obvious colours and then I can start comparing my drawing to my reference and seeing which colours I think are missing. Now while I'm drawing this, I will mention that I'm not actually going to use any Polychromos on the background. I want to use the Polychromos to be adding detail, and there isn't really any detail in this background, it's all very blurred. So actually the pastels are going to be perfect for this section because they are so nice and soft. Once I've built up enough initial layers for the background, I then like to blend with this blending tool. If you don't have something like this blending tool, then you would be perfectly fine to use a cotton bud. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing again, building up a second layer. And that's just going to make the whole area look a bit more uniform. It's going to stop being able to see any paper coming through the pastel. So let's move on to the area where I am going to be using both types of pencils. I'm going to start drawing the pumpkin. All I'm focusing on here here is using the pastels to put down a base layer. So I can start off with the areas that I want to stay a very bright white, and then I want to be once again looking for the most obvious background color in the pumpkin. So here I would say that that's a very light yellow, and then I gradually build up various oranges and browns around the pumpkin. I'm not looking at adding any detail at all here. I'm literally just looking at getting some color down on the paper. This is actually very similar to what I would do if I was using Polychromos on their own. It would just be a far lighter color. It would take longer to build up. I would say that while I'm adding this in, I'm using almost medium pressure. I want to get down a decent amount of color, but I don't want to fully saturate the paper. Now around the bottom of the pumpkin, although it does get very, very dark down here, I'm only going to go as dark as this quite dark red. I'm not going to put in the full depth of colour because I want to add that with the Polychromos. I'm also on the stalk at the top not going to focus on adding any detail whatsoever. I'm literally just trying to get down a base colour and then add in any particularly prominent areas of light. Then the last thing I'm going to do with the pastels for the pumpkin is just add in a little bit of pink. It's just got a little bit of a pinky tone at the top. I then, in the same way that I did for the background, want to blend this all together. When I blend, I always start with the lighter areas and then blend towards the darker. I don't want to risk blending my dark areas into my light and then I lose the vibrancy. I also tend to blend in circles. This helps me to make this as smooth as it possibly can be, which is what I want particularly for my base layer. All right, and let's try putting the Polychromos over the top. Now I was confident that this would work because of those swatches that I made. That said, you don't really know how it's going to work in actuality on a drawing until you try. So I wanted to work through the pumpkin in a similar way to what I would do if I was drawing with colour pencils on their own. So I started by focusing on the stalk of the pumpkin. And actually there was something that I didn't test that I tried early on and I was surprised it worked, which is that I put some white Polychromos down on top of this stalk. I wanted to see if I could add white in with the Polychromos. When I use the pencils on their own, generally the white isn't used to add bright white back into the drawing. If I'm drawing with colour pencil, the white is quite a translucent colour and it doesn't go over the top of darker colours. But I was interested to see if that was the same when you go over pastels, and I was very surprised to see that it did go over the top, and actually it performs in a similar way to how the pastel pencil white performs. It was coming through quite vibrant. So from there, I started working my way through some of the darker colours, so using a kind of reddish brown to add some of the streaks that you can see. It almost looks like bark, the stalk, and then onto the darkest brown to add in the darkest values. I added a few other little adjustments to the stalk, and then I wanted to move on to the bulk of the pumpkin. Now that I knew that the white did cover over the top of the pastel quite well, I started off with the white here, and I just wanted to redefine all of the lightest areas, particularly towards the top. I also used the white to lighten up any areas. I used it much lighter, much softer with the pencil, and it just brightened up the pastel background. So where I added that pink in on the base layer, it just kind of created a light pink. You can very clearly see the texture of the paper here though. So as I move on, I do want to see if there's anything I can do to kind of hide that texture a bit. So similar to when I'm drawing with colour pencils on their own, I started at the lightest and worked my way towards the darker colours. So as I get towards some of the darker browns, I use these pencils to start filling in some of the little dots and blemishes on the skin of the pumpkin. And I did find that this actually was very nice and easy. Although I would say that I could also do this with the pastel pencils, it does take quite a bit more work to get a sharp pastel pencil because I don't use a pencil sharpener for them. I use a blade instead. As I was working through the colours, when I got to this point, I thought the pumpkin needed a bit more red to it. It was all looking a bit too yellowy orange. And from my tests, I did work out that I can put light colour and light shading over the top of the pastel, and it does adjust that colour. So that's what I was doing here with the red. I could also use the red to lightly go over the white. It just slightly hides the bumpiness of the paper, just making the area look a little bit less stark white. And I was able to do the same with this creamy yellow as well. So the paper is now looking less obvious now that I've built up more Polychromos layers. At this point I was relatively happy with the pumpkin, so I wanted to move on to draw the log underneath. I actually think it needs a bit more dark shading along the bottom of the pumpkin, but I thought it would be easier once the log has been drawn. So for the log, I wanted to be focusing on putting down a base layer first. At the moment, I have no pastel down here. Now, the main background colours of the log is a mixture of greys and browns. And I was really focusing on just looking at the main shapes within here, not really looking at any of the little lines that are coming out from the centre of the log. Now, the reason that I haven't put a base down here before now is because pastels are quite easy to smudge. So I wanted to leave myself a little bit of blank paper so I could put my arm here and I didn't need to worry about smudging the base layer. If you didn't want to do that, you could use something like tracing paper to lean on. I do find it's generally better if you can just avoid leaning on the pastel though. So once I put down my base layer here and blended it together once again, blending from the light to the dark, I could then start putting the Polychromos over the top. And I could use this dark Polychromos as a really accurate way of getting all of these lines coming from the center drawn in. I did actually find that this was quite easy, and I would say it was probably easier than doing the pastel on its own. I could then use a variety of the things that I'd learned from using the Polychromos on the pastels. So for example, that I can put some white over the top to brighten some areas up, and that I can add some light shading over the top as well to slightly adjust the color. And then the last thing I wanted to do on this drawing is just deepen down the very bottom of the pumpkin. Now that I can see the pumpkin with the log, it's just a bit easier to see where I need to deepen down some of the shading. So it turns out you can use PITT Pastel pencils as a base layer and put Polychromos over the top. It actually works surprisingly well. Now I probably could have created the same drawing by just using the pastel pencils, although it would have been a bit trickier to get such fine detail. And I could have created a very similar drawing again by just using the Polychromos, but it would have taken a lot longer. If you've also tried this, let me know how you got on. And if you'd like to learn more about pastel pencils, check out my video here where I cover all of the basics. Happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.